On the 4th of October 2009, in a gravel lot behind a closed implement dealership in Tama County, Iowa, a man with grease worked permanently into the creases of his knuckles, laid $250 in worn bills onto an auctioneer's folding table, and was told kindly that he had just bought himself a paperweight. 11 years later, in the spring of 2020, a single object that had passed through that same gravel lot was the reason a small forge in southwest Wisconsin could not answer its phone fast enough. The number tied to it landed on a kitchen table like a verdict no spreadsheet had seen coming. This is the story of the years between those two moments and of a 412-pound block of iron that every trained man in 3 states had already decided was dead. Let me tell you about the man first, because the iron does not make sense without him. His name was Mercer Holt, and in Crawford County, Wisconsin, he was known for 2 things. The first was that he could put an edge on a piece of steel that would shave the hair off your forearm and still cut rope a week later, and the second was that he almost never finished a sentence he did not have to. He was 46 that autumn, a knife maker by trade, and by stubbornness, working out of a converted milking parlor on a hillside above the town of Raleigh Creek, where the coolies fold the land into long green pleats and the cell signal dies before the mailbox. He made hunting knives and kitchen knives and the occasional sheath knife for a man who wanted his initials hidden under the scales. And he made about 90 of them a good year. And in a bad year he made fewer and patched the difference, fixing balers. He worked in those days on an anvil that was failing him. It was a small thing, 112-pound, cast steel anvil he had bought new in his 20s, and for 20 years it had been honest. An anvil is not a passive object. When a smith brings the hammer down on hot steel, the steel takes the blow, and the anvil underneath returns whatever energy the steel does not absorb straight back up into the work, into the hammer, into the smith's wrist and elbow and shoulder. A good anvil gives that energy back. A tired one swallows it. Mercer's had begun to swallow. The face had dished from 1,000 blows, gone soft and cupped in the middle, and every strike now died a little where it should have rebounded, so that by the end of a long day forging he felt the lost energy as a dull ache that climbed from his wrist to the base of his neck. He was spending his own body to make up for what the anvil no longer returned. He had known for a year that he needed a better one. He had not said so out loud because there was no money to say it to. Let me tell you what a real anvil costs, because this is where the trap opens. A new anvil of the size and quality Mercer needed, a forged tool steel block of 300 pounds or more with a hardened face, ran better than $2,000 in 2009, and the good European makers were back-ordered the better part of a year. The cheap imports, the gray cast-iron doorstops sold to people who did not know better, could be had for a fraction of that, and they were worthless because cast iron under a hammer cracks and shatters and gives nothing back. Between the worthless and the unaffordable, there was a third country, and that country was the second-hand market, the estate sales and the farm auctions, and the back rows of implement lots, where the anvils of dead men changed hands. That was the country Mercer hunted in. He had been hunting it for 11 months. And then a man he knew, a horse trader named Ode Vanoy, who drove half of Iowa looking for tack to flip, called him on a Tuesday night and said there was an anvil coming up at a dispersal sale near Toledo, Iowa, that nobody wanted to touch, and that Mercer should come look at it before somebody hauled it off for scrap. The reason nobody wanted to touch it was simple, and it is the whole hinge of this story. So I'm going to slow down here. When you go to buy a used anvil, you do not have a laboratory. You have a hammer in your ear. You set a steel ball bearing on the face and you let it drop, and a good anvil throws it back up, nearly to the height you dropped it from, because the hardened face returns the energy. That is rebound, and rebound is the single thing that separates a working anvil from a boat anchor. Then you take a small hammer and you tap the face all over, corner to corner, and you listen. A sound anvil rings. It sings a clear, bright tone that hangs in the air, the sound of a single solid piece of properly heat-treated metal. And if the ring goes flat anywhere, if you tap a spot and hear a dull thud instead of a song, the trade wisdom is brutal and old and nearly always right. A dead spot means a crack. A crack means the face is delaminating from the body, separating in a hidden seam, and an anvil with a delaminating face is firewood. You do not buy it at any price. The anvil near Toledo rang dead. Not in a spot, all over. Ode had tapped it himself and handed Mercer the phone like a man reporting a death in the family. 3 different buyers had already walked the thing, a farrier from Cedar Rapids and a hoppy smith from the Quad Cities and a scrap man who weighed everything in his head, and all 3 had set the little hammer on that face and heard the same low, flat, lifeless thunk, and all 3 had set the hammer down and walked away. The scrap man had offered $80 by the pound price of iron. The auctioneer had not even bothered to clean it. Mercer drove 11 hours. It was not 11 hours each way by any straight road. It was 11 hours because the dispersal sale fell on the same long weekend as a farm show down by Dubuque and the Interstate. Through there was a parking lot of stock trailers, and Mercer's old crew cab diesel did not love to idle, so he ran the river roads, the county 2 lanes that follow the... And he stopped twice to let the truck cool, and once to sleep 90 minutes in a church parking lot in Gutenberg, with his coat over the wheel. He left Rowley Creek at 1 in the morning. He got to the gravel lot in Tama County a little after noon. Let me tell you why a careful man drives 11 hours to look at iron. 3 other careful men have already condemned. He had a hunch, and the hunch was not magic. It was reading. Mercer Holt did not have a degree in anything. What he had was a shelf of books in the milking parlor, gun show paperbacks and library discards, and 1 cloth-bound volume on the manufacture of wrought iron anvils that he had read so many times the spine had given up. And in that book and in the others was a fact that the trade wisdom had flattened and lost. The old anvils, the ones forged before about 1910, were not solid steel. A great body of wrought iron, fibrous and tough and nearly impossible to break, with a thin plate of hardened tool steel, forge welded onto the top to take the hammering. 2 metals, 2 natures, married in a fire by men who hammered them together while the whole mass glowed. And here was the part the trade had forgotten. The ring of an anvil, that clear singing tone everyone trusted, came from a single homogeneous piece of steel. A built anvil, an honest wrought iron-bodied anvil with a steel face perfectly welded down, did not always ring like that. Sometimes the very best of them, the ones with the most massive bodies and the tightest welds, rang low and dull, because the 2 married metals damped the tone between them. The dead sound could mean a crack. It could also mean a forge weld so complete across a body so heavy that the iron simply refused to sing. You could not tell the 2 apart by ear. That was the whole problem. A dead ring told you something was different, and refused to tell you what. But there was a second test, and the second test could not be faked. And 3 careful men had skipped it, because the first test had already scared them off. The second test was rebound. When Mercer walked across that gravel lot, past the hay rakes and the parts bins and the auctioneer already droning over a wagon of milk cans, he did not bring out a hammer. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a 1-inch hardened ball bearing he carried, the way another man carries a pocket knife, and he held it at the height of his own eye over the center of that condemned Anvil's face, and he let it go. It came back to his hand. Not to a dead thud on the iron, it came back almost the whole way, snapping up off that face with a life nobody in the lot had bothered to look for, because they had all stopped at the ring. He dropped it again from the heel and again from the horn and again from the dead center, where the work would land, and every time the little ball leapt back like it had somewhere to be. 90% of the height, 95, a rebound as bright as any new anvil, twice the price. The face was not cracked. The face was magnificent. It was a forge weld so total that the steel and the iron underneath had become, for the purposes of a hammer, one body. The dead ring was not the sound of failure. It was the sound of a 412-pound mass, too well made to sing. He stood up and put the ball bearing back in his pocket and waited 2 hours for the lot to come up, and he tried to look bored. Which brings us to the man who would spend the next 11 years being wrong about Mercer Holt in public. His name was Garth Pell, and he was not a fool. And I want to be careful here, because the easy thing would be to make him a villain, and the easy thing would be a lie. Garth Pell ran a tool and equipment supply business out of Cedar Rapids, a clean, bright operation with a showroom and a forklift and a website, and he sold new anvils, German and Austrian, 300 to 600 pounds, $1,800 and up. He had a certificate on his wall from a Tool Appraisers Association. He had earned it, and he genuinely knew the metallurgy of new equipment as well as any man in the state. He had come to the Toledo sale because dispersal sales sometimes coughed up a pallet of good import hand tools he could buy cheap and mark up clean. He had walked the old anvil himself earlier, and tapped it and heard the death in it, and written it off, and he was right to, by every rule he had been taught. What he could not stand was watching a man in a barn coat outbid the scrap price on a corpse. The anvil came up at noon, and the auctioneer apologized for it before he started. He said the face was bad, said it plain, said he had to say it, and opened the bidding at $50, hoping the scrap man would take it away. The scrap man bid $50. Mercer bid $60. The scrap man, knowing exactly what iron weighed in dollars, bid $70 and meant it as a ceiling. Mercer said $250 in a flat voice without looking up, and the lot went quiet, and the auctioneer, who had been doing this 40 years and had never in his life had to talk a man down, looked at Mercer and asked him, off the chant, in a normal voice, if he understood the face was cracked. Mercer said he understood the face. Fine, Garth Pell laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was worse than cruel, because it was generous, the laugh of a man who thinks he is about to do you a favor. He stepped half out of the crowd, and he said, loud enough for the lot, that he hated to see anybody throw good money after a delaminated anvil, that he'd tapped it himself, that the ring was gone all the way across, and that the gentleman, and he said gentleman the way another man might say son, the gentleman was buying scrap at jewelry prices. He said if Mercer wanted a real anvil, he'd cut him a deal on a proper German tool back at the shop, a tool with a warranty, a tool a professional could stand behind. Mercer paid the $250 in worn bills onto the folding table. He did not take the deal. He did not argue the metallurgy. He did not take the ball bearing back out of his pocket and prove it, though he could have, and a smaller man would have. And that is the thing about Mercer Holt you have to hold on to for the next 11 years, because the whole story turns on it. He had nothing to prove to Garth Pell. He had an anvil to get into his truck. Two men from the lot helped him lever it up a ramp on a furniture dolly, 412 pounds of it, and the truck sat down on its springs, and Mercer signed the slip and drove 11 hours home with the dead-ringing corpse the appraiser had laughed at riding behind the seat. To Garth Pell, in that gravel lot, it was a cracked anvil and a charity case. To Mercer Holt, it was the best tool he would ever own, and did not yet know how to say. To the auctioneer, it was a strange thing he would tell his wife about that night, and to the story, it was the seed of every number that came after. Let me tell you what changed when he got it home, because this is where the iron starts paying. He bolted it to a stump of solid white oak. He cut and dried himself, set the face at the height of his own knuckles with his arm hanging straight, which is the right height, and almost nobody gets it right. And he lit the forge the next morning and brought a bar of high-carbon steel up to a heat, the color of a ripe apricot, and laid it on that condemned face, and swung. The steel moved. It moved like he was 20 again. Every blow he put down came back up, the energy he used to spend into his own joints now returning off that massive welded face and driving the hammer back toward the next stroke, so that the work seemed to forge itself, and a job that used to cost him 100 swings cost him 60. He stood at that anvil the whole first day, and into the dark, and his wrist did not ache, and his neck did not climb. And when he finally banked the forge, he set his hand flat on the cool iron in the dark of the milking parlor, and he left it there a long minute, the way you'd lay a hand on a horse that had carried you farther than you'd ask. His wife came out to the parlor near midnight with a plate, because he had not come in. Her name was Linnea, and she had married him, knowing exactly what she was marrying, a man who would drive 11 hours toward a hunch and not call to say where he was. She looked at the dead-ringing anvil he'd hauled across the state, and she looked at the row of finished blades on the bench more than he'd made in any single day in years. And she did not say a word about the $250 they had not exactly had. She set the plate down. She said the iron looked like it suited him. Then she went back to the house, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Here is the mechanism, plainly, because the niche I am telling you about lives or dies on whether the thing actually works, and this thing worked for a reason you can hold in your hand. An anvil returns energy in proportion to two things: the hardness of its face and the mass behind that face. The hardness sets how little of the blow gets absorbed at the surface. The mass sets how little of it gets lost into motion, because a heavier anvil moves less under the hammer, and so wastes less. Mercer's old anvil had failed on both counts at once. Its face had gone soft and cupped, absorbing the blow at the surface, and at 112 pounds it was light enough that some of every stroke went into shaking the tool instead of shaping the steel. The condemned anvil fixed both failures in a single object. Its forge-welded steel face was as hard as anything made, returning the blow clean. And at 412 pounds, nearly 4 times the mass, it sat under the hammer like bedrock and gave back energy his old tool had been quietly stealing from his body for years. The dead ring that frightened everyone off was, if anything, evidence in its favor, the acoustic signature of exactly the massive, tight-welded body that made it return so much. They had heard the best feature of the anvil and run from it. That winter Mercer made 140 knives. He had never broken 110. The arithmetic was not mystical. He was faster at the anvil because the anvil gave back, so each blade cost him less time and less body, and the body was the part that had been running out. He could stand and forge 5 days where he used to manage 3 before his wrist forced him down. He was 46, and the tool had handed him back the hands of a younger man, and you cannot put that on a balance sheet, but you can count the blades, and there were 140 of them, and they sold. Now I told you Garth Pell would spend 11 years being wrong, and I owe you the rest of that, because a man who laughs once in a gravel lot is just a man having a bad afternoon. What made Pell the foil of this story is that his being wrong was not a single moment. It was a whole way of seeing, and he kept it, and it kept costing other people, and the cost ran on a parallel track right alongside Mercer's quiet rise, and the two tracks did not meet again for a long time. Let me lay Pell's track down beside Mercer's, because the contrast is the lesson. Garth Pell sold new anvils, and his whole business rested on a fact that looked permanent in 2009 and was not. The good new anvils came from a handful of forges in Europe and one drop forge operation in the American South, and they were expensive because forging a 300-pound anvil to a hardened face is brutal, dangerous, energy-hungry work that few places on Earth still did. Pell's model was clean. He imported the tools, warehoused them, marked them up, sold the warranty, and the certainty along with the steel. He told customers honestly that the second-hand market was a minefield, that old anvils were a gamble, that a professional bought new and bought known. And, for a man with $1,800 and no time to learn the rebound test, he was not even wrong. He was selling a real service to people the old market scared. What he could not see, because his model could not measure it, was that the old market was not a minefield. It was a library. Every condemned anvil in every gravel lot in the Midwest was a forged, wrought-iron-bodied tool that would outlast every man who would ever own it, mispriced to scrap because the trade had forgotten how to read it. The knowledge to read it cost nothing but a ball bearing and a winter of books. Pell sold certainty because he had decided the knowledge was unavailable. Mercer had simply gone and gotten the knowledge, and it had cost him $250 and 11 hours. And a laugh he did not bother to answer. For years, Pell's track ran higher and brighter. His showroom grew. He added a second forklift, a second salesman, a line of imported tongs and hammers, and a fabrication shop in the back that took on contract work. He was, by every measure his certificate taught him to use, winning. Mercer's track ran low and steady and almost invisible. 140 knives, then 160. A reputation that moved by word of mouth among hunters and chefs and the kind of customer who finds out about a knife maker from the man ahead of him in a deer check line. A waiting list that lengthened by a few names a year. No website worth the name. No warranty but Mercer's own. Let me tell you about the daughter, because the next generation is where the doubt gets voiced, and the story needs it voiced. Mercer and Linnea had a daughter named Sasha, and by the time she was grown, she had her mother's flat good sense and her father's hands, and she came home in 2017 from 2 years at a technical college with a head full of real numbers and a worry she finally said out loud one evening in the parlor. She loved the knives. She did not love the math. She had run the books over Christmas, and she told her father plainly that he was leaving money on the bench, that the waiting list was 18 months long and the prices were a decade out of date, that other makers with half his skill were charging twice his price and selling out. And she used the word carefully because she was not trying to wound him inefficient. She said he should hire help, buy a power hammer, build a real shop, take the deposits up front, scale the thing while the name was hot. Mercer listened to all of it. He did not get defensive because she was not wrong about any single number she'd named. Then he set down the blade he was working, and he said one thing, and it is the only speech he makes in this whole story, and it is 2 sentences long. He said, "The anvil only gives back what you put into it, and not 1 ounce more." He said that was true of everything he knew. Sasha did not understand it that night. She thought he was being stubborn, dressing up a refusal to grow as a philosophy, and for a while the 2 tracks of this story ran inside one family, the father's patience and the daughter's arithmetic, neither one able to prove the other wrong. She was 23, and she could see the money he was not making. Ia. He was 54, and he could feel the thing she could not put in a column, which was that a shop with employees and a power hammer and $40,000 of deposits is a different animal than a man and an anvil, and the different animal has a different appetite and feeds in good times and starves in bad ones. And he had lived through enough bad ones to be careful. He let her start a website. That was the compromise. She built it on a winter weekend, photographed 40 blades in the good north light of the parlor, and put up a single page with no shopping cart, just the work and a phone number and a note that the wait was long. She thought it was a half measure. She was right that it was. She was wrong about what it would do. Which brings us back to the iron and to the spring of 2020, when the bottom fell out of the world Garth Pell had built his certainty on. Let me tell you what happened, because it happened to everyone at once, and it happened fast. In the early months of 2020, the long, thin supply lines that carried new anvils across an ocean simply stopped. The European forges shuttered for the spring. The freight that did move tripled and quadrupled in price. And the one American drop forge that had made affordable new anvils the floor under Pell's whole business had been struggling for years against exactly the energy and labor costs that made forging anvils brutal. And it chose that spring to wind the line down for good. Almost overnight, there were no new anvils to be had at any price a working person could pay. Pell's showroom, the clean, bright operation built on importing certainty, had a warehouse that emptied and would not refill. He had built a business on being the reliable source of a thing, and the thing had vanished from under him, and his model had no answer, because his model had never measured the fragility of the single thin line it depended on. And at the very same moment, a generation of people stuck at home discovered they wanted to make things with their hands. The demand for the skill of forging exploded that spring, and behind it came a demand for the one tool you cannot forge without. And there were no new anvils, and a whole anxious market of new smiths turned to the old one, the second-hand market. The estate sales and farm auctions and back rows of implement lots. The very library Garth Pell had spent a decade telling people was a minefield. They turned to it terrified, because they had all read the same trade wisdom that a dead ring means a crack, that an old anvil is a gamble, and they did not know how to tell a corpse from a king. They needed someone to teach them to read. Sasha was the one who saw it. Vet. She was the one who lived online in a way her father never would, and she watched the forums and the videos fill up with panicked new smiths asking the same question over and over. How do I know if this old anvil is any good? Is a dead ring a deal breaker? And she watched 100 wrong answers pile up. And one March night she carried her phone out to the parlor and asked her father to do, on camera, the thing he had done in a gravel lot 11 years before. He did not want to. He thought it was foolishness. He did it because she asked. She propped the phone on the bench, and Mercer stood at the 412-pound anvil and explained, in the flattest, plainest voice you ever heard, with no music and no hurry, why the thing everybody trusted was a liar. He tapped the face and let it thud dead for the camera. He said most men would walk away right there, and most men would be wrong about a third of the time, and on the best anvils they'd be wrong every time. Then he took the 1-inch ball bearing out of his coat pocket, the same test, and he dropped it from the height of his eye and caught it coming back. And he explained mass and hardness, and the forge-weld in words a person who had never held a hammer could follow. He said, the ring tells you the metal is different. The rebound tells you whether different is good. He said, learn the second test and the whole condemned half of the market opens up to you, full of the best tools ever made, priced like scrap because the people selling them only know the first test too. The video was 9 minutes long. He never raised his voice. He never mentioned Garth Pell, whose name he had nearly forgotten. By the end of that week, 200,000 people had watched a Wisconsin knife maker drop a ball bearing onto a dead-ringing anvil, and by the end of the month it was past 1 million, and the small page Sasha had built as a half-measure had a phone number on it, and the phone in the milking parlor that had no good signal began, against all odds, to ring. Let me tell you what it was worth, and then let me tell you why the number is not the point, even though it lands like the point. The knives were never the windfall, though the waiting list went from 18 months to 4 years in a single spring, and Mercer finally, at Sasha's insistence and his own grudging arithmetic, raised his prices to where they should have been a decade earlier. The windfall was the teaching. A small press for old, simple, hard-won knowledge that the world had forgotten it needed, dropped into a moment when 10 million people suddenly needed exactly it. Sasha turned the one video into a careful, unhurried series, her father at the Anvil explaining one real mechanism at a time. The rebound test, the forge weld, the right anvil height, how to read a heat by color, how to tell wrought iron from steel by the way it broke. No hype, no music. A 54-year-old man in a condemned anvil in the plainest voice in the Midwest, teaching the second test to a generation that had only ever been taught the first. In the 3 years that followed the channel, the knives, the small run of plain-talking instructional work Sasha built around her father's hands, and a modest line of the simple tools he actually used, brought in a number that Mercer made her write down twice, because he did not believe it the first time. $2,400,000. He sat at the kitchen table in Rowley Creek and looked at the figure his daughter had written on the back of a feed store receipt, and the parlor light came through the window and lay across it, and he did not say anything for a while. 2.5 decades of 90 knives a year had built a life and not much margin. 11 years with a tool 3 men had condemned, and one 9-minute video showing the world how to read it had built something his whole trade would have called impossible. The thing that did it was not a secret. It was the rebound test, and a winter of books, and a willingness to drive 11 hours toward a hunch. He had owned the knowledge the whole time. The world had simply, finally, needed it all at once. To the bank, 11 years earlier, that Anvil had been a $250 charge against an account that could not spare it. To Garth Pell, it had been a cracked corpse and a charity case. To the scrap man, it had been $80 of iron by the pound. To Mercer Holt, it had been the whole time the best tool a smith could own, and the seed of every good year that followed. The market had needed a structural shock, a snapped supply line, and a shuttered forge, and a locked-down spring. To finally agree with the man who had read it right in a gravel lot when reading it right was worth a laugh. Now let me tell you about Garth Pell, because the niche I'm telling you about does not believe in defeated men, only corrected ones, and Pell earned his correction honestly. His business did not survive the spring intact. The warehouse emptied and would not refill, and a model built on importing certainty had no answer when the certainty stopped arriving. He laid off the second salesman. He nearly lost the building. And one evening, looking for a way to keep the lights on, doing the thing a beaten man does, he sat down and started watching the videos everyone in his trade was suddenly talking about. The Wisconsin knife maker teaching people to read old iron, and somewhere in the third or fourth one he recognized the flat, unhurried voice and the barn coat, and finally, with a jolt, the 412-pound anvil, and he understood, 11 years late, what he had laughed at in a gravel lot in Tama County. He drove up to Rowley Creek that summer. He did not call ahead because he did not know how to say what he was coming to say. He found the converted milking parlor on the hillside above town, and he found Mercer at the Anvil, and he stood in the doorway a while before Mercer noticed him, and when Mercer did, he set down the hammer and waited the way he had waited in the gravel lot, with nothing to prove. Garth Pell asked him to show him the test. That was the whole apology, and it was the right one, because it was not words. It was a credentialed man with a certificate on his wall, 58 years old, asking a man with no degree to teach him the thing his certificate had missed. Mercer took the ball bearing out of his coat pocket, the same one, 11 years older and no different, and he set it in Garth's hand and told him to drop it from the height of his eye. Garth dropped it. It leapt back into his palm off the dead, ringing face, alive, undeniable, exactly the proof he had refused to look for in a gravel lot, because the ring had already told him a story he trusted more than his own eyes. He stood there holding the ball bearing a long time to his credit, and the narrator of this story insists on his credit. Garth Pell did not make excuses. He did not say the trade wisdom was reasonable, though it was. He did not say 3 other men had walked the same anvil, though they had. He looked at the iron and he said quietly that he had sold certainty his whole life and had never once stopped to ask whether the thing he was certain of was true. Mercer did not gloat. There was nothing in him that wanted to. He told Garth the test was old and free, and that anybody could learn it, which was the kindest and the most honest thing he could have said, because it was an offer, not a victory. Garth Pell went home and rebuilt his business on a different floor. He stopped selling certainty and started selling knowledge. He turned a fabrication shop into a place where new smiths could bring an old anvil and learn to test it, where the second-hand market he had spent a decade calling a minefield was treated, finally, as the library it was. He sent customers to Mercer's videos. Yes. He did the thing the best version of a corrected man does, which is to take the correction and pass it forward, and in a few years his business was smaller and steadier, and by the only measure that it ever mattered, sound. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing I drove the long way around to reach. Sasha learned what her father had meant, not all at once, and not from the $2.5 million, though the number got her attention. She learned it watching the new smiths who rode in, the ones who took the rebound test out to a farm auction and came home with a 400-pound anvil for $90 and wrote to say it had changed their work and their wrists and their whole sense of what was possible with their hands. She had wanted, at 23, to scale her father, to hire and buy and borrow and grow the animal until it filled the building. And she watched instead a man who had refused all of that hand a piece of free knowledge to 10,000 people and right-size something in each of their lives. And she understood, finally, the 2 sentences he had said in the parlor and never explained. The anvil gives back what you put into it, and not 1 ounce more. He had put in 11 years of reading and 1 winter of books, and a willingness to be laughed at in a gravel lot, and the iron had given it back. Exactly, faithfully, the way a forge weld too tight to wring gives a hammer everything it brings. He had never asked it for more than he put in. That was the whole discipline, and the whole difference between the two tracks of this story. Garth Pell had spent years trying to get more out than the model had earned, importing certainty he had not verified, selling a sureness he had never tested, and the structural shock had simply collected the difference. Mercer had spent the same years putting in attention and getting back exactly what he put in, and when the shock came, he had nothing to lose and a library to share. There are two kinds of knowing in this story, and the spring of 2020 told them apart the way a ball bearing tells a king from a corpse. There is the wide, bright, confident kind, the kind with a certificate and a showroom, the kind that knows the metallurgy of every new tool and the price of every import and the wisdom of the whole trade, and mistakes the trade's wisdom for the truth. And there's the narrow, deep, patient kind, the kind that knows one old book and one old test and one piece of ground so well that it can read what the whole trade has agreed to misread. The wide kind is right almost always, in ordinary weather. The deep kind is right at the one-time horizon that finally matters when the weather breaks. Mercer Holt is past 60 now, and he still makes about 90 knives a good year, because that was never the part that needed to grow. The 412-pound anvil is still bolted to its white oak stump in the old milking parlor, set at the height of his hanging knuckles, and it still rings dead when you tap it. The same flat, lifeless thud that sent 3 careful men walking in a gravel lot. The same dead ring that means nothing at all about whether it is the best tool in 3 states. In the evenings, when the forge is banked and the parlor has gone to shadow, and the coolies outside have folded down into dark, he will sometimes set his hand flat on the cool face of that iron the way you'd lay a hand on a horse, and leave it there a minute, and you would not, from the dead ring of it, ever guess what it gave back.